The warm afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Flight AC-247 as passengers filed aboard for the 5-hour journey from Vancouver to Toronto. Among them was a bright-eyed 7-year-old girl clutching her beloved stuffed penguin, accompanied by her grandmother. The pair made their way down the narrow aisle, the elderly woman carefully guiding her granddaughter past the rows of seats. The little girl, wearing a sparkly purple backpack and light-up sneakers, couldn't contain her excitement. This was her first time flying alone with her grandmother, and everything about the massive aircraft fascinated her. Her father, a prominent airline industry executive, had arranged the trip so she could spend spring break with her grandma while he attended important business meetings overseas. As they found their seats in economy class, the grandmother helped the child settle in, making sure she was comfortable for the long flight ahead. The little girl's eyes widened with wonder as she watched other passengers storing their bags and finding their places. She hugged her penguin closer, whispering secrets about their adventure together. A flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform walked past, performing her pre-flight checks. The little girl, naturally curious and friendly, waved enthusiastically at her. "Hello. This is Mr. Waddles," she said, holding up her stuffed penguin. "It's his first time flying too." The flight attendant barely glanced at the child before letting out an exaggerated sigh. "This isn't a playground," she said curtly. "Please keep your voice down and your toys to yourself." Her tone was sharp enough to make the little girl shrink back in her seat, lower lip trembling. The grandmother, surprised by this unnecessary harshness, placed a protective arm around her granddaughter. "There's no need for that tone," she said quietly. "She's just excited about her first flight." The flight attendant rolled her eyes. "I deal with hundreds of children every week, ma'am. They all need to learn proper airplane etiquette." She continued down the aisle, leaving behind a thick cloud of tension and a dejected little girl. As other passengers settled in, many witnessed this interaction with disapproving looks. A kind-faced businessman across the aisle offered the little girl a sympathetic smile, which she returned shyly, clutching Mr. Waddles closer to her chest. The flight progressed, and the attendant's attitude didn't improve. When the drink service began, she practically threw the little girl's apple juice onto her tray table, causing some to splash onto Mr. Waddles. The child's eyes welled up with tears as she tried to dry her beloved penguin with a napkin. "Oh dear, look what you've done now," the flight attendant remarked sarcastically. "This is exactly why children shouldn't have toys out during beverage service." She didn't offer any extra napkins or assistance, instead moving on to serve other passengers while muttering under her breath about parents these days. The grandmother, normally a patient woman, felt her anger rising. She had worked in customer service herself for over 30 years and knew this behavior was completely unacceptable. She pressed the call button, intending to speak with another crew member about the situation. Meanwhile, the little girl sat quietly, no longer the bouncing, excited child who had boarded the plane. She focused on carefully wiping her penguin's wet feathers, occasionally glancing nervously at the aisle whenever the flight attendant passed by. Her grandmother's heart ached seeing her usually vibrant granddaughter so subdued. What the flight attendant didn't realize was that this particular flight would become a turning point in her career. Unknown to her, several passengers had already begun documenting her behavior on their phones, and a series of events was about to unfold that would remind everyone about the importance of kindness, especially to the smallest among us. As the plane continued its journey eastward, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. The next few hours would bring revelations that would shake the flight attendant's professional world to its core, and teach her a valuable lesson about judging others too quickly. The grandmother's call button remained unanswered for 20 minutes. When another flight attendant finally responded, she was immediately apologetic, sensing the tension in the air. The grandmother, speaking in hushed tones to avoid upsetting her granddaughter further, explained the situation. The second flight attendant's eyes widened as she listened, occasionally glancing at the little girl who was now coloring quietly in her activity book. "I'm so sorry about this experience," the second attendant whispered. "I'll speak with my colleague immediately. Would you like me to notify the head purser about this situation?" The grandmother nodded, then pulled out her phone and showed some photos to the kind flight attendant. Whatever she saw made her face pale slightly. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, a distinguished-looking man in an expertly tailored suit was working on his laptop. He was reviewing documents about airline customer service protocols, ironically, the very same airline they were currently flying with. As the Chief Operations Officer of North American Operations for the airline's parent company, he had been receiving concerning reports about customer service incidents over the past few months. Back in economy class, the rude flight attendant continued her shift, unaware that her behavior had set off a chain of quiet conversations throughout the aircraft. The businessman across the aisle had discreetly filmed her interactions on his phone. A retired teacher 3 rows back had written detailed notes about the incidents. Even the young couple in the row behind the little girl had emailed a complaint to the airline's customer service department using the in-flight Wi-Fi. 2 hours into the flight, turbulence struck. The little girl, still subdued from her earlier experiences, clutched Mr. Waddles tightly as the plane bounced through rough air. Her grandmother held her hand, telling her stories about when her father was her age and how he too had been afraid of turbulence on his first flight. The problematic flight attendant chose this moment to pass by with the trash collection. When a particularly strong bump caused her to stumble slightly, she snapped at the little girl, "Put that stuffed animal away. It's a hazard during turbulence." Her voice was loud enough to carry across several rows, causing other passengers to stare in disbelief. The grandmother had reached her limit. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience dealing with difficult people, "I'd like to speak with the head purser immediately." The flight attendant scoffed, "The head purser is busy with more important matters in first class." What she didn't know was that the head purser was already aware of the situation. The second flight attendant had quietly briefed her superior, showing her the photos the grandmother had shared. The head purser was now reviewing the airline's Code of Conduct manual while occasionally glancing at a particular passenger in first class. The little girl, trying to be brave, whispered to her grandmother, "Daddy says we should always be kind, even when others aren't. He says it's what makes a person truly special." The surrounding passengers who overheard this exchange smiled warmly at the child's wisdom. A few rows ahead, 2 off-duty pilots traveling as passengers exchanged knowing looks. They had recognized the man in first class when they boarded, and they knew exactly who this little girl's father was. One of them discreetly sent a text message as soon as the plane reached a lower altitude. The flight's captain soon received a message in the cockpit that made him raise his eyebrows. He called the head purser for a brief conversation. Minutes later, the head purser was seen walking purposefully toward economy class, followed by the kind second flight attendant. The rude flight attendant was just finishing another sharp comment about children on planes when her superior appeared beside her. "We need to speak privately," the head purser said firmly. "Right now." The color drained from the flight attendant's face as she finally noticed the numerous passengers watching her, many with phones in hand. As they walked toward the galley, the kind second flight attendant stayed behind to chat with the little girl. She admired Mr. Waddles, helped clean his remaining sticky spots from the juice incident, and even gave him a tiny wing pin, making him an honorary crew member. The grandmother watched this interaction with approval, then checked her phone again. There was a message from her son-in-law in first class, "Is everything okay back there? I'm getting some concerning messages." She began typing a response, knowing that the next few hours would bring some significant changes to this flight's atmosphere. In the galley, the head purser was having a serious conversation with the problematic flight attendant. "Do you recognize the name of the passenger in 7C?" she asked, showing her a passenger manifest. The flight attendant glanced at it dismissively, then did a double-take. Her eyes grew wide as she finally made the connection, and realized the magnitude of her mistake. The little girl's father wasn't just any airline executive, he was the person responsible for overseeing customer service standards across the entire airline group. And in just 2 hours, this flight would land in Toronto, where he was scheduled to lead a major conference on improving passenger experience, using real-world examples of what to do and what not to do in customer service situations. The flight attendant stood frozen in the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she held the passenger manifest. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had spent the last 2 hours being deliberately unkind to the daughter of one of the airline's most senior executives. But worse than that, she had broken the fundamental rules of customer service and basic human decency. In first class, the little girl's father was reviewing a series of messages and emails that had begun flooding his inbox. Multiple passengers had used the in-flight Wi-Fi to report the incidents, complete with video clips and detailed descriptions. His expression remained calm, but anyone who knew him well would recognize the subtle tightening around his eyes that indicated his growing concern. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder labeled Customer Experience Initiative 2025. Inside were the materials for tomorrow's conference, including a section about the impact of frontline staff behavior on passenger loyalty. He had planned to use hypothetical scenarios in his presentation. Now, it seemed reality had provided a much more powerful example. Back in economy class, the kind second flight attendant had brought the little girl a special hot chocolate, complete with whipped cream and a chocolate cookie on the side. "Mr. Waddles looks much better now," she said warmly, adjusting the wing pin on the stuffed penguin's chest. "You know, I think he's the best-behaved penguin I've ever had on my flights." The little girl giggled for the first time since the journey began, some of her natural cheerfulness returning. "He says thank you," she replied, carefully wiping a spot of whipped cream from Mr. Waddles' beak. "And he likes your smile. It's much prettier than the other lady's frown." Several passengers nearby nodded in agreement, and the businessman across the aisle closed his eyes briefly, thinking about his own daughter at home. He had already decided to share his recorded footage with the airlines customer service department. Not out of spite, but because he believed in standing up for what was right. The head purser was now faced with a delicate situation. Protocol dictated that she should inform the captain about any significant issues involving crew members, but she also needed to handle this diplomatically. After all, they still had 2 hours of flight time remaining, and the comfort and safety of all passengers was her primary concern. She made her decision. Return to the first-class cabin, she instructed the problematic flight attendant. "Stay there for the remainder of the flight. I'll handle economy service myself." The flight attendant nodded mutely, her earlier arrogance completely deflated. As she made her way forward, she had to pass by the little girl's row again. This time, she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of dozens of disapproving stares from the surrounding passengers. The grandmother watched her pass with a mixture of satisfaction and pity, satisfaction that justice would be served, but pity for someone who had chosen such an unfortunate path. The retired teacher who had been taking notes caught the head purser's attention. "I spent 40 years in education," she said quietly. "The way we treat children shapes not only their day but their understanding of the world." That flight attendant didn't just fail at her job today, she failed at being a decent human being. Meanwhile, the little girl's father had made his way to the economy cabin, casually walking past his daughter's row as if he were heading to the lavatory. He noticed her happily sharing her cookie with Mr. Waddles, the special wing pin glinting on the penguin's chest. The sight of her smile eased some of the tension in his shoulders. Children were remarkably resilient, after all. The grandmother spotted him and gave a subtle nod. They had agreed before the flight not to let their young passenger know her father was aboard. It was supposed to be her special adventure with Grandma, and despite the unfortunate incidents, they wanted to preserve that aspect of her journey. In the first-class galley, the problematic flight attendant was attempting to compose herself. Through the curtain, she could hear snippets of conversation from premium passengers discussing the situation. Word had spread throughout the aircraft, as it tends to do in these enclosed spaces at 35,000 feet. One of the off-duty pilots approached the head purser. "I've worked with her father," he mentioned quietly. "He's known for being fair but firm when it comes to passenger experience issues. He believes that how we treat our most vulnerable passengers, children, elderly, those with special needs, defines us as an airline." The head purser nodded, remembering the numerous training sessions and memos that had emphasized this very point. She thought about her own career, spanning 20 years in aviation, and how she had learned that kindness was not just part of the job, it was the foundation of everything they did. As the flight continued eastward, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. There was a sense of anticipation, of justice about to be served, but also of something larger, a reminder that in a world that can sometimes seem cold and disconnected, standing up for what's right still matters. The little girl, now happily engaged in teaching Mr. Waddles about cloud formations with help from the kind second flight attendant, remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. Perhaps that was the best outcome, that despite encountering someone determined to dim her light, others had stepped in to help it shine even brighter. As the flight entered its final hour, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Toronto. The little girl pressed her face against the window, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and pink. She had recovered her spirits thanks to the kindness of the second flight attendant and the supportive passengers around her. In the first-class cabin, the problematic flight attendant was mechanically going through her duties, her movements stiff and her usual confidence shattered. Every time she passed the little girl's father, who was now reviewing documents on his tablet, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had learned that he was not just any executive, but the architect behind the airline's new passenger experience initiative, set to launch at tomorrow's conference. The grandmother had received another text from her son-in-law, landing in 45 minutes. Meeting with senior crew scheduled immediately after arrival. Don't worry about baggage claim, car service arranged. She smiled, knowing that while her granddaughter's father was a kind man, he was also thoroughly professional when it came to maintaining service standards. The head purser had spent the last hour documenting everything in detail. She had collected statements from nearby passengers, including the businessman who had recorded the incidents and the retired teacher who had taken careful notes. What struck her most was how the other passengers had united to support the little girl, creating a protective community at 35,000 feet. "Excuse me," a soft voice called out. It was the young couple sitting behind the grandmother and child. "We fly this route every month for business, and we've never seen anything like this before. We just wanted you to know we've already submitted our feedback to corporate." The head purser thanked them, adding their statement to her growing file. The kind second flight attendant had become something of a hero to the nearby passengers. She had transformed what could have been a traumatic experience for a child into a memorable adventure. Mr. Waddles now sported not only his wing pin but also a handmade name tag identifying him as honorary junior crew member, Atlantic Routes. As they began their descent into Toronto, the little girl clutched her penguin tightly. "Grandma," she whispered, "do you think the angry lady was having a really bad day? Daddy always says sometimes people are mean because they're hurting inside." The grandmother's eyes welled up at her granddaughter's compassion, even after everything that had happened. The businessman across the aisle overheard this and shook his head in amazement. He had been composing an email to his own daughter, telling her about the brave little girl he'd met on his flight who had shown more maturity than many adults he knew. In the cockpit, the captain was preparing for landing while reflecting on the situation. In his 30 years of flying, he had learned that the true measure of an airline wasn't just in its on-time performance or modern fleet, but in how it treated its most vulnerable passengers. Tomorrow's conference would certainly have some real-world examples to discuss. The problematic flight attendant stood in the galley, staring at her reflection in the metal surface of the coffee maker. She thought about her 12 years of service with the airline, about how somewhere along the way she had lost sight of why she had chosen this career in the first place. It had never been about just serving drinks or giving safety demonstrations, it was about making people feel safe and cared for at 35,000 feet. As the plane descended through the clouds, the little girl's father made another casual pass through economy class. This time, he noticed something that made his heart swell with pride. His daughter was showing another child, a nervous-looking boy about her age, how to make Mr. Waddles dance to help distract him from the landing. She was passing on the kindness she had received, creating a small ripple of compassion that spread through the cabin. The head purser finished her report just as the landing gear descended. She had documented not just the negative incidents, but also the positive responses from the crew and passengers. In her conclusion, she wrote, "While this situation highlighted a serious breach of our service standards, it also demonstrated the true spirit of air travel, how strangers can come together to support one another in difficult moments." The plane touched down smoothly on Toronto's runway, the setting sun casting long shadows across the tarmac. As they taxied to the gate, the captain made one final announcement: "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Also, would all crew members please report to the chief purser before disembarking." The problematic flight attendant felt her stomach drop. She knew that this wasn't just about one bad day or one upset child. This was about the fundamental principles of human kindness and professional responsibility. As the plane approached its final parking position, she realized that the longest part of her journey was just beginning. Meanwhile, the little girl was carefully packing Mr. Waddles into her backpack, making sure his new wing pin was secure. "You did so good today," she told him, not realizing that those words could have been said about her too. She had faced unkindness with resilience and had even managed to find joy in the journey, thanks to the people who had chosen to stand up for what was right. As passengers began collecting their belongings, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with anticipation. Ground crew could be seen through the windows, and among them were two individuals in corporate uniforms, holding tablets and speaking into headsets. The airline's response to the situation was already in motion. The little girl's father had quietly disembarked first, nodding subtly to his mother-in-law as he passed. He had received word that the airline's regional director of customer experience was waiting in the terminal, having rushed from a meeting after receiving multiple real-time complaints through the airline's customer feedback system. The problematic flight attendant stood rigid in the galley, watching as passengers filed past. Many gave her pointed looks, while others simply shook their heads in disappointment. The young couple who had sat behind the little girl paused briefly. "We hope you learn from this," the woman said quietly. "Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, especially children." In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered near the gate desk. The businessman who had recorded the incidents was showing his footage to two airline representatives, who were taking detailed notes. The retired teacher stood nearby, reading from her own documentation of the events. "I've never seen such unprofessional behavior in all my years of traveling," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Back on the plane, the grandmother was intentionally taking her time gathering their belongings, knowing what was about to unfold. The little girl was carefully checking her seat pocket, making sure she hadn't forgotten anything from her adventure with Mr. Waddles. The kind second flight attendant stood nearby, helping other passengers but keeping a protective eye on her young friend. "Look, Grandma," the little girl exclaimed, pointing out the window. "There's Daddy." She waved enthusiastically at her father, who was now visible through the terminal windows, engaged in serious conversation with several airline officials. The grandmother smiled, knowing her son-in-law's presence would ensure appropriate action was taken. The head purser gathered her crew near the front galley. "Management will be speaking with each of us individually," she announced, her voice professional but firm. They're particularly interested in hearing about the positive interventions that helped salvage the situation. She looked meaningfully at the kind second flight attendant, who had done so much to turn the little girl's experience around. As the last passengers deplaned, the problematic flight attendant received a message on her company phone: report to gate supervisor's office immediately upon deplaning. Crew transfer arranged for return flight. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. In the terminal, the little girl's father was reviewing the situation with the airline's senior staff. His daughter's experience would become a pivotal case study in tomorrow's conference, but more importantly, it would lead to immediate changes in crew training and customer service protocols. The kind second flight attendant helped the grandmother with their carry-on bags as they finally prepared to deplane. The little girl turned to her and asked, "Will you be my flight attendant again next time?" The question brought tears to several observers' eyes, highlighting the impact that simple kindness could have on a child's perception of the world. Outside the gate, a small crowd of airline staff had gathered, word having spread quickly about the high-ranking executive's daughter and the incident on board. The problematic flight attendant would have to walk past them all to reach the supervisor's office, her walk of shame made more poignant by her own choices. The regional director of customer experience was already preparing a preliminary report. "This isn't just about one bad incident," he explained to his team. "This is about reinforcing our core values. Every interaction with every passenger matters, but how we treat children and vulnerable passengers defines us as an airline." As the grandmother and little girl emerged from the jet bridge, they were greeted by warm smiles from the ground staff. The little girl, still clutching Mr. Waddles with his proud wing pin, had no idea that her experience would become a watershed moment for the airline's customer service training program. The businessman who had recorded the incidents approached the girl's father before leaving. "I have a daughter about her age," he said quietly. "What happened today wasn't just unprofessional, it was wrong on a human level. I'm glad someone in authority witnessed it firsthand." Throughout the terminal, passengers from the flight were sharing their stories with other travelers. The young couple had already posted about their experience on social media, praising the airline's swift response while condemning the initial treatment of the child. Their post was quickly gaining attention, with many commenting on the importance of kindness in customer service. The problematic flight attendant finally made her way to the supervisor's office, passing by crew members who had already heard about the incident. Her career, built over 12 years, now hung in the balance, not because of one bad day, but because she had forgotten the fundamental purpose of her role: to ensure every passenger, regardless of age or status, felt safe and respected in the skies. The supervisor's office buzzed with activity as airline officials gathered to address the situation. The problematic flight attendant sat alone in a corner chair, her posture deflated, watching as various managers and supervisors reviewed footage from passengers' phones. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Meanwhile, in the terminal's VIP lounge, the little girl's father was holding an impromptu meeting with his senior staff. "Tomorrow's conference just got real-world application," he said, his voice calm but determined. "What happened today isn't just about my daughter, it's about every child who flies with us, every passenger who trusts us with their journey." The kind second flight attendant had been asked to provide her statement. She described how she'd witnessed the situation unfold and felt compelled to intervene. "In our training, we're taught that every interaction matters," she explained. "But today showed me that it's more than policy, it's about basic human dignity." Outside the airline's offices, the story was gaining traction. The young couple's social media post had caught the attention of several travel bloggers, who were now reaching out to the airline for comment. The retired teacher had shared her detailed account with a popular travel advocacy group, adding weight to the growing narrative. The grandmother and little girl were being escorted to their waiting car service, accompanied by the airline's customer service manager. The little girl was chattering happily about Mr. Waddle's new wing pin, blissfully unaware that her experience was catalyzing major changes in airline policy. Back in the supervisor's office, the problematic flight attendant was facing the consequences of her actions. The head purser's report lay open on the desk, alongside statements from multiple passengers. The airline's HR director spoke firmly but fairly, "This isn't just about breaking protocol. You violated our most basic principle, treating every passenger with respect and dignity." The regional director of customer experience was already drafting new training protocols. "We'll use today's events as a case study," he explained to his team. "But we'll focus not just on what went wrong, but on how the positive actions of other crew members and passengers help transform a potentially traumatic experience for a child." In the terminal, the businessman who had recorded the incidents was sharing his contact information with airline officials. "I travel weekly for work," he explained. "I've seen my share of difficult situations, but this was different." The contrast between the two flight attendants showed exactly what customer service should and shouldn't be. The kind second flight attendant received an unexpected request. The airline wanted her to become part of their training team, helping to develop new protocols for handling sensitive situations involving young passengers. Her actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of empathy and professionalism the airline wanted to cultivate. As evening fell over Toronto, the story continued to evolve. The airline's social media team was responding to the growing online discussion, not with corporate platitudes, but with genuine acknowledgement and commitment to change. They announced an immediate review of customer service training, with special emphasis on interactions with young passengers. The problematic flight attendants' union representative arrived, having been called in for the disciplinary proceedings. Even he seemed taken aback by the severity of the situation after reviewing the evidence. "We protect our members' rights," he said quietly, "but we also expect them to uphold the standards of their profession." In the car riding to their hotel, the little girl finally began to doze off, clutching Mr. Waddles. The grandmother texted her son-in-law, "She's okay. Actually, she's more than okay." She learned that for every unkind person, there are many more who will stand up for what's right. The airline's executive team was now fully engaged in damage control, but not in the typical corporate way. Instead of trying to minimize the incident, they were using it as a catalyst for genuine change. The COO, the little girl's father, had already approved a new initiative, Every Journey Matters, focusing on ensuring every passenger, regardless of age or status, felt valued and respected. The story had touched a nerve in the traveling public, perhaps because it reflected a universal truth, that kindness and cruelty can exist side by side, but it's how we respond to each that defines us. Comments poured in from around the world, with many sharing their own experiences of both exceptional service and disappointing treatment. As night fell, the problematic flight attendant left the airline's offices, her future with the company uncertain. She had been suspended pending a full investigation, but the bigger punishment was perhaps the recognition of how her actions had affected a child, and how that child's inherent kindness had shown her the true meaning of professionalism. The kind second flight attendant, now being hailed as an example of excellence in customer service, reflected on the day's events in her crew report. "Sometimes the smallest passengers teach us the biggest lessons. Today reminded me why I chose this career, not just to serve passengers, but to make their journey better, one interaction at a time." The next morning, the Grand Ballroom of Toronto's Aviation Conference Centre was packed with airline executives, training managers, and customer service representatives from across North America. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread about yesterday's incident, and everyone knew today's presentation would be different from what was originally planned. The little girl's father stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Yesterday, we had planned to discuss theoretical scenarios about customer service," he began. "Instead, life handed us a real masterclass in both how to fail our passengers and how to lift them up." Screens around the room displayed carefully edited footage from the flight, provided by concerned passengers. The audience watched in silence as the story unfolded, the initial harsh treatment, the intervention by the kind second flight attendant, and the remarkable response from fellow passengers. In the hotel across the street, the grandmother was helping her granddaughter get ready for a day of sightseeing. The little girl was still chattering about her flying adventure with Mr. Waddles, focusing on the positive moments, the special hot chocolate, the wing pin, and the kind flight attendant who had made her feel special. Back at the conference, the kind second flight attendant had been invited to speak. She stood nervously before the crowd, her newly pressed uniform reflecting her pride in her profession. "When I saw what was happening," she explained, "I didn't think about policies or procedures. I thought about how I would want someone to treat my own child." The airline's training director then unveiled the new "Every Journey Matters" initiative. "Yesterday's incident taught us that our standard training modules weren't enough," she announced. "We need to embed empathy and kindness into every aspect of our service, not just as guidelines, but as fundamental principles." Meanwhile, the story had gained significant traction on social media. The young couple's post had gone viral, with millions of shares and comments. People weren't just angry about the negative behavior, they were inspired by how the situation had been transformed by simple acts of kindness. The problematic flight attendant's story had also become a talking point. Rather than publicly shame her, the airline had chosen to use her actions as a learning opportunity. "We're not here to celebrate failures," the little girl's father explained to the conference attendees. "We're here to learn from them and ensure they never happen again." During the lunch break, many attendees shared their own stories of challenging situations with passengers. The consensus was clear: while rules and procedures were important, the human element of air travel could never be forgotten. Every passenger, especially the most vulnerable, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The airline's new training program would include significant changes. Role-playing scenarios would now feature real-world situations, including interactions with children, elderly passengers, and those with special needs. The kind second flight attendant had been asked to help develop these modules, bringing her practical experience to the training environment. In the afternoon session, the businessman who had recorded the incidents was invited to speak. He shared his perspective as a frequent flyer and a father. "What struck me wasn't just the poor behavior," he explained, "but how one person's kindness could ripple through an entire aircraft, changing everyone's experience." The retired teacher had also been invited to share her observations. Her decades of experience working with children added weight to her words: "When we interact with children, we're not just providing a service, we're shaping their view of the world." Yesterday, thanks to the actions of many, a potentially negative experience became a lesson in human kindness. As the conference continued, airline representatives from other companies took notes and asked questions. The incident had struck a chord industry-wide, prompting many carriers to review their own training programs and customer service protocols. The kind second flight attendant received several job offers during the conference breaks, but she politely declined them all. "I'm where I need to be," she explained. "This airline is showing real commitment to change, and I want to be part of that transformation." By late afternoon, the conference had evolved into a collaborative workshop. Attendees broke into groups, discussing real-world scenarios and developing practical solutions. The focus wasn't just on preventing negative incidents, but on creating consistently positive experiences for all passengers. The airline's social media team provided updates throughout the day, sharing the positive changes emerging from the incident. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive, with many praising the airline's transparent approach to addressing the situation. As the conference drew to a close, the little girl's father shared one final thought: "Yesterday, my daughter taught us all a valuable lesson. She showed us that even in difficult moments, kindness can prevail. And that's not just good customer service, it's good humanity." 6 months after the incident, the airline's training center buzzed with activity as a new batch of flight attendants gathered for their certification ceremony. At the front of the room stood the kind second flight attendant, now the lead instructor for the airline's revamped customer service program. Her story had become legendary within the company, a testament to how one person's compassion could create lasting change. The little girl and her father had been invited as special guests to the ceremony. Now 8 years old, she sat in the front row, Mr. Waddles still proudly wearing his wing pin on his chest. The stuffed penguin had become something of a mascot for the airline's new training program, symbolizing the importance of treating every passenger, no matter how small, with dignity and respect. Today marks another milestone in our journey, the airline's CEO announced to the gathered crowd. In the past 6 months, our customer satisfaction ratings have reached historic highs. But more importantly, we've created a culture where kindness isn't just encouraged. It's expected. The "Every Journey Matters" initiative had transformed the airline's approach to customer service. Training now included extensive modules on empathy, cultural sensitivity, and handling vulnerable passengers. The kind second flight attendant's actions had become a case study, demonstrating how simple acts of kindness could transform a passenger's entire experience. The problematic flight attendant's story had also taken an unexpected turn. After her suspension and subsequent resignation, she had written a lengthy letter to the airline, the little girl, and her family. Rather than making excuses, she had taken full responsibility for her actions and described how the incident had forced her to confront deep-seated issues in her own life. Sometimes our greatest mistakes lead to our most important lessons, she had written. The airline had included her letter, with permission, in their training materials, not to shame her, but to show how self-reflection and accountability could lead to personal growth. The businessman who had recorded the incident was now part of the airline's customer advisory board. His experience as a frequent flyer and parent brought valuable perspective to the company's decision-making process. What happened that day showed us that customer service isn't just about procedures and protocols, he shared during the ceremony. It's about seeing the humanity in every passenger. The retired teacher had been invited to help develop special training modules for handling young passengers. Her decades of experience working with children had proved invaluable in creating guidelines that emphasized both practical skills and emotional intelligence. The young couple whose social media post had gone viral were now travel bloggers, regularly featuring stories of exceptional customer service in the airline industry. Their original post about the incident had evolved into a movement, with travelers sharing their own experiences of kindness at 35,000 feet. As part of the ceremony, the airline unveiled a new recognition program named after Mr. Waddles, the Waddles Award for Excellence in Customer Care. The first recipient was, fittingly, the kind second flight attendant who had started it all. Her eyes welled with tears as she accepted the award, remembering that day 6 months ago when a simple choice to be kind had set so much in motion. The grandmother, who had also been invited to the ceremony, watched with pride as her granddaughter presented the award. The little girl had grown more confident in the months following the incident, often telling other children about how being kind is like a superpower, it can change someone's whole day. The airline's commitment to change had rippled throughout the industry. Other carriers had begun implementing similar training programs, recognizing that in an age of viral videos and instant communication, genuine kindness was not just good service, it was good business. The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement. The airline was launching a children's program called Junior Flight Crew, inspired by Mr. Waddles' honorary wing pin. Young passengers would receive special attention and care, ensuring their early experiences with air travel were positive and memorable. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, the little girl approached the kind flight attendant who had helped her that day. "Mr. Waddles and I are going to fly again next month," she announced proudly. "Will you be there?" The flight attendant knelt down to eye level with the child. "I might not be on your flight," she explained gently, "but thanks to you and Mr. Waddles, there are now hundreds of flight attendants who know exactly how to make every child's journey special." The little girl's father watched this interaction with satisfaction. What had started as an unfortunate incident had blossomed into something remarkable, a genuine transformation in how an entire industry approached customer service. His daughter's experience had reminded everyone that behind every policy, procedure, and protocol, there were real people with real feelings. As the sun set over the training center, casting a warm glow through the windows, the CEO made one final observation. 6 months ago, we learned that our youngest passengers often teach us our most important lessons. Today, we celebrate not just a change in policy, but a change in perspective. Every interaction, every moment, every journey matters, because behind every ticket is a human story waiting to be told. The legacy of that fateful flight continued to influence the airline industry, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the smallest moments, and that kindness, when chosen deliberately and consistently, could transform not just one flight, but an entire culture.